Yo, what's up YouTube? In this video, I'm going to talk about using templates for composing, why that's important, and I'm also throwing in some advice on how to set up your own. Feel free to skip ahead a bit if you're one to get straight to the work. And for those of you who are thinking, well, I'm just a beat maker, I just make electronic music, don't worry, there's a lot in here that I'm sure will help you. So first I'm going to start with why use a template when you're writing music. I see my template as a workbench, and I think you should too. Think of it as a place where all your tools are organized by how they're used and what they do. It's about efficiency and frame of mind. Let's start with efficiency. Most composers, or some as you would say, producers, work with deadlines. My personal threshold is about 11 minutes a week with about 2 minutes a day, with some days left over for mixing and finalizing. But even without that kind of schedule, a template helps by saving you time with ergonomics. It decreases the amount of time between your creative idea and the sound you're trying to make. Every time you have to import a new instrument and wait for it to load, it kills your creativity little by little. It helps your ergonomics by making it easier to think and reach for multiple instruments. Being able to quickly press a button and record an idea into a piano track means the difference between capturing that creative moment or trying to remember it like last night's dream. Having a template allows your mind to think within certain parameters instead of having to start from nothing each time. For example, I know that I have this orchestral sound in this manner right here, and that I have the synths, pianos, live audio, sound effects all waiting for me, and I have this percussion. So when I'm imagining music, I can think in these terms. Similar to how if you always have the same ingredients in your fridge, you know that when you bring in a new ingredient, it makes it easier to imagine new recipes. So that was why you should use a template. Here's some ideas on how to set up yours. First, let's start with orchestral order. Orchestral order is something every composer and producer should know. It's the standard for organizing tracks and scores. In short, it's winds, brass, percussion, and then strings. And then everything extra either goes between strings and percussion, on top of percussion, or on top of the score. For the people that don't necessarily write orchestral music, it means you should still consider having some standard for organizing your tracks. So just think drums on one section, synths on another, samples on another, etc. There is actually a guide to track organization, and you can just Google that. There's a guideline for audio engineers. So what do we start with? Let's start with these tracks up here. First up is the temp or reference track. So what the temp track is that it's a track where you can put music that either inspires you, or if you're trying to get a similar sound, something that you can reference really quickly. Video, if you're writing music for video, this is pretty obvious. You should have a track or a set of tracks where you have the video laid out. I usually have the first copy, and then every additional copy, every new version of video will go on top, and it'll be renamed Video 2. Etc. Or if a certain version has time code or something, it'll go based off that. So for example, let's say you get a rough copy. Let's say you get a rough copy of the video, and then you write to that video, but then they send you another copy that they say, well, we have these edits, but they might not be set in stone yet. So you're going to want to keep each version of video there until you get a final cut. So you can go ahead and delete that. Here's something that I think you should do as well. So I recommend separating the video's sound onto a separate track so that you can make adjustments to it and do things like typical things I might do are narrow the width of it and then also lower its volume and EQ out the low end, because I usually like working now with a bunch of rumbly noise. Usually the first versions I get have a lot of ambient noise. They aren't the ADR versions of the video. And then probably a limiter. So that's the kind of things I'll do to the sound of a video, just so that when I'm working with, it makes it easier to listen to and there's not a bunch of random noise. The next thing to do with your template is to organize all your sounds and group them under similar instruments. The next thing to do with your template is to group similar tracks and set the balance levels, because if you just have everything at 0 dB, your master fader is just going to be clipping like crazy, especially with the way some samples are set up to where they're almost clipping right out of their sampler. I personally have everything at 12 decibels, which gives me a lot of headroom to work with. Most of the time I end up staying around this range because I know that later on in the mixing stage, I end up pulling down these faders to negative 12 decibels anyway. After that, a simple thing to do is to make sure that all your tracks have this number sign on them. And what that does is that not only does it number it, but if you move these tracks around, the numbering is dynamic to them. And that helps not only with organization, but for example, let's say you want to resample a certain part of your mix so that you can apply some effects on it. Having the number signs lets you quickly use the keyboard to pick your instrument. See that? So there's a lot of benefits to that, as opposed if they were all just not named, and then they would be in this order, but they would not let, it would be harder to choose from the list. Next up is key mapping. So here are a couple things that I have key mapped that I think are pretty standard to have, to the point where I think Ableton might consider including them in their default. First off is a metronome. That is key mapped to M, pretty logical. The stop button, I actually key mapped to the button right next to the pause button, so that not only can I stop music, but I can go back to the beginning as opposed to having to click back up here. The record button is already mapped to F9. I've also added L for loop, and then the buttons right next to it for punch in and punch out. So if you see, I can quickly loop a selection, choose whether or not I want it looped or not, and then choose which punch in or punch out I'm doing. Just makes it easier for on-the-fly recording. Next up, there's a marker button. So what that means is that I can quickly use S to set markers, and then I can use A and D to switch between them. It's really good for when you're trying to quickly set points in the music. Next up is the tilde to 9 key button. So if I press the tilde, you'll see that it solos my reference and my video. By default, I have these two unactive so that they only sound when I solo them. So that means I can be playing a clip and then quickly solo just to get a sense of how my idea is working. Next on the key mapping is on the 1 key. You'll notice that I have the sound and the sound effects tracks set to the 1 key. And this is so that I can quickly get rid of any sound and just listen to the music. And then on 2, we have synths. On 3, we have piano. Four is woodwinds, and I have it set to alto flute. 5 is brass. 6 is marimba. 7 strings, then percussion, then my special siege drums. The cool thing about this is that, let's say for example, I want bassoon. I can quickly switch to woodwinds and then using my keyboard switch to that instrument. So it just lets you go from, like, you know, let's say for example, playing something in the piano and then quickly switch into the strings, as opposed to having to come back in and scroll up and then find the specific one. It just streamlines the process. On MIDI mapping, one thing I do usually have MIDI mapped is the Q button or the Q volume, so that you can quickly change the volume of the metronome and volume of the samples you're playing from the browser. Also, you'll notice that on my live audio tracks, they're preset to the inputs I usually use for guitar or for bass. So these are already set to their dedicated inputs. If you'll notice that in the woodwinds, we have ensemble and staccato ensemble for quick sketching, and then for individual instruments, I have them all in orchestral order. The same goes for brass and strings. Another thing I wanted to show you is that I do have Ableton's stock keyboard, the Grand West Village. But you'll notice that I have quite a lot of things going on with it. And the idea here is the point with instruments like these is that you should really try and create your own sound, your own voice by developing your instruments and by building up on the tweaks and adjustments they prefer. And just a couple more tips. If you look at my strings, I've doubled up on them, and it's hard to explain why to do that. And the reason I do that is because a lot of these instruments usually depend on key switching, which is where you use a specific note below the range of the instrument to change its articulation. And while that's great if you like working that way, for me that seems a little counterintuitive, and I just prefer having everything on its own track. So staccatos are on their own track, pits on their own track, and then solo strings are on their own track. One thing I would suggest is having a sub so that you can double the bass line very lightly and get a really good low end going for you. Next is reverb and return tracks. So in the past, I've had each instrument group routed to its own reverb and then having a master reverb at the end of the chain to really get a good kind of placement of each group, and it helps to glue the sound together a bit. I noticed that I would end up changing so much at the end and at the mix phase that it wasn't worth having all these reverbs set up. So now I just use one main reverb and everything else is effect chains after that. I would still recommend having each instrument group to its own reverb for a while so you get to know the sound of that. And maybe that might work for you. For me, it just kind of seemed like a waste of time, but I know there's a lot of producers that do have that set up in their template. A couple other things. If you have instruments that you've built yourself, you want to continuously develop those and get them part of your sound so that not only do you have the same samples that everyone else has, but you also have something unique to offer. Something to let you stand out. For me, that's my drumline stuff and the way I kind of EQ everything and play stuff in the mix and my writing style. So even though I have the same samples as everyone else, I tend to go my own way with it and not leave anything stock sounding at all. So that's about it for this video. I hope it was helpful and that there was some good advice in there for you. These videos that I do aren't really meant to be professional tutorials. They're more like hangouts where I just share experience and share advice. But still, I welcome all feedback. So if you have any comments or questions, leave them below. Let us know if there's anything cool about your template that you would like to share. And thanks again for watching. Peace.